In the unforgiving skies above Afghanistan, where death comes without warning and heroes are born in split seconds, two F-16 pilots were about to witness something that would shake them to their core. What started as a routine combat air patrol turned into a desperate rescue mission when an A-10 Thunderbolt disappeared behind enemy lines. But when the wreckage was finally spotted and the tail number came into focus through their targeting systems, both pilots felt their blood run cold. The aircraft they were staring at belonged to someone they knew intimately. Someone who wasn't supposed to be flying that day. Someone whose presence in that cockpit would change everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of brotherhood in the skies of war. The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram Airfield as Captain Jake Viper Morrison suited up for what he believed would be another routine combat air patrol over the mountains of Afghanistan. The year was 2010, and the war was at its peak intensity, with coalition forces engaged in daily firefights against Taliban insurgents who seemed to emerge from every cave and valley in the region. Jake had been flying F-16 Fighting Falcons for 6 years, with over 200 combat missions under his belt, but something felt different about this particular Tuesday morning in March. His wingman, Captain Sarah Phoenix Chun, was going through her pre-flight checklist in the adjacent hangar bay. Sarah was one of the few female fighter pilots in their squadron, and she had earned her call sign the hard way, by literally rising from the ashes of a training accident that should have ended her career before it started. She was known for her precision flying and her ability to stay calm under the most intense pressure. The two had flown together dozens of times, developing the kind of unspoken communication that only comes from trusting someone with your life on a regular basis. The briefing that morning had been straightforward. Intelligence reports indicated increased enemy activity in the Khyber province, near the Pakistan border. Their mission was to provide close air support for ground troops, conducting sweep operations in several villages suspected of harboring high-value targets. The terrain in that region was notoriously difficult. Steep mountain valleys, limited visibility, and unpredictable weather patterns that could turn deadly in minutes. As Jake performed his walk-around inspection of his aircraft, he noticed Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the crew chief, seemed more tense than usual. Rodriguez had been maintaining F-16s for over 15 years, and Jake had learned to read his moods like a weather forecast. When Rodriguez was nervous, there was usually a good reason for it. "Everything looking good, Chief?" Jake asked, running his hand along the sleek fuselage of his fighter. Rodriguez wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag and nodded slowly. "Aircraft's perfect, Captain. It's just—" He paused, looking out toward the flight line, where other aircraft were being prepared for the day's missions. "We lost contact with Hammer 21 about an hour ago. A-10 was providing close air support for a patrol that got pinned down near the border. Last radio transmission indicated they were taking heavy ground fire." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. Hammer 21 was the call sign for one of their A-10 Thunderbolt pilots, though he didn't immediately recall who was flying that particular aircraft that morning. The A-10, affectionately known as the Warthog, was specifically designed for close air support missions. Its heavily armored cockpit and redundant systems made it one of the most survivable aircraft in the Air Force inventory. But even the mighty Warthog had its limits. "Any word on search and rescue?" Jake inquired, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Rodriguez shook his head grimly. "Weather's turned bad in that sector. Heavy cloud cover, visibility near zero. So our birds can't get in there until it clears up." 30 minutes later, Jake and Sarah were airborne, their F-16s climbing rapidly through the crystal-clear morning air above Bagram. The contrast between the peaceful blue sky at altitude and the violent reality unfolding in the mountains below was something that never ceased to amaze Jake. At 25,000 feet, the world seemed serene and infinite, but he knew that just a few miles away and several thousand feet lower, American soldiers were fighting for their lives in terrain that looked like something from another planet. "Viper, this is Phoenix." Sarah's voice crackled through his headset. I'm picking up multiple emergency beacons on the guard frequency. Looks like we're not the only ones having a busy morning. Jake checked his instruments and confirmed the signal she was referring to. Emergency beacons were automatically activated when an aircraft's systems detected a crash or when a pilot manually triggered them during an emergency situation. The fact that there were multiple signals wasn't necessarily unusual. Pilots often tested their emergency equipment or accidentally triggered beacons during training exercises. But, given the morning's events, Jake suspected these signals were the real thing. Their radio, suddenly, came alive with urgent transmissions from the airborne warning and control system aircraft circling high above the battlefield. All stations, this is Magic 41. We have multiple troops in contact situations developing across sectors 7 through 12, requesting immediate close air support for units in contact with enemy forces. Jake felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the transition from routine patrol to active combat operations. This was what they had trained for, what they lived for, the opportunity to use their skills and their aircraft to save American lives on the ground. But as they began their descent toward the target area, Jake couldn't shake the image of that missing A-10 and its pilot somewhere in the unforgiving mountains below. The weather deterioration that Rodriguez had mentioned was immediately apparent as they approached the operational area. What had been clear skies just minutes earlier was now a solid wall of gray clouds, with visibility dropping to mere hundreds of yards in some areas. The mountains created their own weather systems, and conditions could change from perfect flying weather to completely unsurvivable in a matter of minutes. Magic 41, this is Viper Flight of 2, Jake transmitted. We're approaching the target area, but visibility is extremely limited. Can you provide vectors to troops in contact? The response came back immediately, tinged with urgency. Viper Flight, we have a ground unit approximately 15 miles north of your current position that has been engaged with enemy forces for over 3 hours. They're running low on ammunition and requesting immediate close air support. Additionally, we need you to keep your eyes open for any sign of Hammer 21. Last known position was in that same general area. Jake exchanged glances with Sarah, though they were several hundred yards apart in their respective aircraft. The unspoken communication was clear. They were potentially flying into a situation where they would need to simultaneously engage enemy forces while searching for a downed pilot. It was the kind of multi-layered mission that separated experienced combat pilots from those who might crack under pressure. As they descended through the cloud layer, the landscape below revealed itself in patches through breaks in the weather. The terrain was absolutely brutal. Steep-sided valleys with no suitable landing areas, rocky outcroppings that would make helicopter rescue operations nearly impossible, and dense forests that could hide entire armies of enemy fighters. It was the kind of geography that had swallowed up military forces for centuries, from Alexander the Great's armies to Soviet forces during their occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. Viper, this is Groundhog 6. A new voice came over the radio, this one clearly belonging to a soldier on the ground. The voice was strained, with the unmistakable sound of automatic weapons fire clearly audible in the background. We are in heavy contact with estimated company-sized enemy force. We have wounded and are critically low on ammunition. Request immediate air support. Over. Jake could hear the desperation in the ground commander's voice, and he knew that time was running out for the soldiers below. But as he scanned the terrain for any sign of enemy positions, movement, or the missing A-10, he realized they were facing one of the most challenging situations of his military career. The weather continued to deteriorate as they circled the area, with visibility dropping to less than half a mile in some sections. Flying at low altitude in such conditions was inherently dangerous, even without enemy ground fire to worry about. The mountains created unpredictable wind currents and downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into the ground before a pilot even realized what was happening. Phoenix, I'm going to take the lead on the close air support mission, Jake transmitted to Sarah. I need you to continue the search pattern for Hammer 21. If that pilot is alive down there, we're running out of time to find him. Sarah acknowledged the plan, and Jake began his attack run on the enemy positions that the ground controller had marked with smoke. As he dove toward the target, his aircraft shuddering slightly in the turbulent air, he couldn't help but think about the A-10 pilot somewhere in this same dangerous airspace. The Warthog was built to survive exactly this kind of mission, but even the toughest aircraft had limits, especially when facing determined enemies with modern anti-aircraft weapons. The engagement that followed was intense and brief, with Jake making multiple passes over enemy positions while Sarah continued her search pattern. Each time he pulled up from an attack run, Jake scanned the surrounding terrain for any sign of wreckage, parachute, or signal that might indicate the location of the missing pilot. It was during his fourth attack pass that Sarah's voice suddenly filled his headset with an urgency he had never heard from her before. "Viper, this is Phoenix. I've got wreckage. A-10 wreckage. Grid coordinates follow." Jake immediately broke off his attack and climbed to rejoin his wingman. As he approached the coordinates Sarah had provided, he could see the distinctive silhouette of an A-10 Thunderbolt scattered across a rocky slope approximately 2 miles from where the ground troops were engaged with enemy forces. The aircraft had clearly impacted the mountainside at high speed, with debris scattered over several hundred yards. The main fuselage was relatively intact, which was typical for A-10s due to their robust construction, but Jake could see immediately that this had been a catastrophic crash. No pilot could have survived the initial impact. As they circled the crash site, Jake began to make out details through his targeting pod display. The aircraft's tail number became visible as they made their second pass, and Jake felt his heart stop as the numbers came into focus on his screen. "Phoenix, are you seeing this tail number?" Jake transmitted, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause before Sarah responded, and when she did, Jake could hear the shock in her voice. "Confirmed, Viper. That's Hammer 21. But it wasn't just any A-10. Jake recognized that specific tail number, those particular markings, and suddenly everything about this mission took on a completely different meaning. The aircraft they were looking at belonged to someone they both knew very well, someone who had been scheduled to be on leave that week, someone who had no business being in that cockpit on that particular morning. The implications of what they were seeing began to sink in as they continued their orbit around the crash site. This wasn't just a routine combat loss. This was something that would change everything they thought they understood about the events of that morning and the weeks leading up to it. The tail number staring back at them through the targeting pod display belonged to Captain Marcus Bulldog Williams, Jake's former roommate from flight training, and one of the most respected A-10 pilots in their wing. But Marcus was supposed to be on emergency leave in Colorado, dealing with his father's sudden heart attack. Jake had personally driven him to the airport just 3 days earlier, watching his friend board a transport flight back to the States with a promise to return in 2 weeks. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah transmitted, her voice tight with confusion and growing concern. "Bulldog left on Sunday. I saw the leave paperwork myself. His father was in intensive care at Denver General." Jake's mind raced through the possibilities, none of which made any sense. Military leave, especially emergency leave, was sacred. No commander would recall a pilot from family emergency leave unless the situation was absolutely desperate, and even then, there were protocols that had to be followed. The fact that Marcus was flying this morning in this aircraft meant that something had gone terribly wrong with the official story they had all been told. As they maintained their orbit around the crash site, Jake noticed something else that didn't fit the standard narrative. The wreckage pattern indicated that the A-10 had been flying at extremely low altitude when it impacted the mountain, much lower than would be normal for a close air support mission. The aircraft had clearly been trying to fly through the valley rather than over it, suggesting that Marcus had been attempting to stay below radar coverage or avoid surface-to-air missile engagement envelopes. "Phoenix, take a look at the impact pattern," Jake transmitted. "That's not consistent with taking ground fire during a normal CAS mission." He was flying nap of the Earth, probably trying to avoid detection. Sarah adjusted her aircraft's position to get a better angle on the wreckage, and Jake could see her F-16 banking steeply as she maneuvered for a closer look. The weather was still deteriorating, with cloud cover dropping lower by the minute. But they both knew they couldn't leave without understanding what had happened to their friend. Viper, I'm seeing impact damage that's inconsistent with ground fire, Sarah reported after several minutes of careful observation. The damage pattern on the fuselage suggests he might have taken a surface-to-air missile hit, but the impact angle indicates he was still in control when he hit the mountain. Jake absorbed this information while simultaneously monitoring the ongoing ground engagement several miles away. The American patrol was still in heavy contact with enemy forces, and they would need to return to provide air support soon. But the mystery of Marcus Williams and his A-10 was becoming more compelling and disturbing with each passing minute. Magic 41, this is Viper, Jake transmitted to the AWACS aircraft. We've located Hammer 21. Aircraft is destroyed, impact with terrain. No signs of pilot survival. Request you pass to search and rescue that recovery operations will be required when weather permits. The response from the AWACS controller was immediate and surprisingly detailed. Viper, roger your report. Be advised that Hammer 21 was conducting a classified mission in support of Special Operations Forces. Further details are restricted. Return to close air support for Groundhog 6 immediately. Jake and Sarah exchanged confused glances across the distance, separating their aircraft. A classified mission involving Special Operations Forces was not something that would typically be assigned to a pilot who was supposed to be on emergency leave. More importantly, it was not the kind of mission that would be conducted without extensive briefing and coordination with other aircraft in the area. Something's really wrong here, Sarah transmitted on their discrete frequency. If Bulldog was flying a classified mission, why weren't we briefed? Why didn't anyone know he was in the area? And how did he end up flying when he's supposed to be in Colorado? Jake didn't have answers to any of those questions, but he was beginning to suspect that the official story about Marcus Williams and his emergency leave might not be the complete truth. As they began their return flight to assist the ground troops, Jake found himself thinking about the last conversation he had had with his friend at the airport 3 days earlier. Marcus had seemed different that day, more tense than Jake would have expected, even given the circumstances with his father's health crisis. There had been something in his eyes, a kind of haunted look that Jake had attributed to worry about his family situation. Now he wondered if there might have been something else troubling his friend, something that might explain why he was flying a classified mission when he should have been at his father's bedside. The close air support mission for the ground troops took precedence over their speculation, and for the next hour, Jake and Sarah focused on the immediate task of keeping American soldiers alive. The enemy forces they were engaging were well-equipped and determined, using advanced tactics that suggested they were not typical Taliban fighters. They had positioned themselves in locations that maximized their defensive advantages while minimizing their exposure to air attack, and they were using sophisticated communication systems to coordinate their movements. During a brief lull in the engagement, while Jake was circling at altitude waiting for the ground controller to identify new targets, Sarah's voice came over the radio with a discovery that made the mystery even deeper. Viper, I've been thinking about the timeline, she transmitted. If Bulldog left Sunday morning on emergency leave, and his father was supposedly in intensive care, why haven't we heard anything from him? No phone calls, no emails, nothing. That's not like him, especially if his father was in critical condition. Jake realized she was right. Marcus Williams was the type of person who stayed in close contact with his squadron mates, even during personal crises. The fact that they hadn't heard from him since he left was itself unusual, but in the context of finding him dead in an aircraft he shouldn't have been flying, it became downright suspicious. Phoenix, when we get back to base, we need to do some checking, Jake replied. Quietly, I want to know who authorized his return from leave, who briefed him on this classified mission, and why nobody else in the squadron knew about it. The remainder of their mission passed without incident, with the enemy forces eventually withdrawing after taking significant casualties from the airstrikes. The American patrol was able to extract safely, though several soldiers required medical evacuation for wounds sustained during the prolonged firefight. As Jake and Sarah turned their aircraft toward home, Both pilots were already mentally preparing for the investigation they intended to conduct once they were back on the ground. The flight back to Bagram gave Jake time to think about what they had discovered and what it might mean. The more he considered the circumstances surrounding Marcus Williams' death, the more convinced he became that there were elements of the situation that didn't match the official story. The question was whether the discrepancies were the result of simple administrative errors or something more serious. As they approached the airfield, Jake could see that activity on the ground was unusually intense. Multiple helicopters were being prepared for launch, and several transport aircraft were being loaded with what appeared to be special operations personnel and equipment. Whatever classified mission Marcus had been supporting was clearly part of a much larger operation, one that was still ongoing despite the loss of the A-10. Viper flight, this is Bagram Tower. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through their headsets. You are cleared for priority landing, runway 21. Expedite taxi to Hangar 7 upon landing. You have priority debriefing scheduled immediately upon arrival. Jake frowned at the unusual instructions. Priority debriefings were typically reserved for missions involving significant intelligence discoveries or unusual combat circumstances. The fact that they were being rushed into debriefing suggested that someone was very interested in what they had seen during their mission, particularly their discovery of the crashed A-10. As they touched down and taxied toward the designated hangar, Jake noticed that Hangar 7 was not one of the normal squadron facilities. It was part of the Special Operations Complex, a secure area of the base that most regular Air Force personnel never had reason to visit. The presence of several black SUVs and personnel in civilian clothes around the hangar entrance confirmed Jake's growing suspicion that this debriefing was going to be different from anything he had experienced before. Phoenix, whatever we're walking into, we stick to the facts, Jake transmitted as they shut down their engines. We report exactly what we saw, nothing more, nothing less. But we don't volunteer any of our speculation about the timeline or the inconsistencies. Sarah acknowledged his instructions, though Jake could tell she was as concerned as he was about the implications of being debriefed by special operations personnel rather than their normal squadron intelligence officer. As they climbed out of their aircraft and began the post-flight inspection process, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something much larger and more complex than a simple aircraft accident. The crew chiefs who met them were not their normal maintenance personnel, and Jake noticed that they seemed particularly interested in downloading data from the aircraft's mission systems, data that would include all of the targeting pod footage from their orbit around the crash site. Within minutes of landing, both F-16s were being swarmed by technicians who were extracting every piece of information the aircraft had recorded during their mission. As they walked toward Hangar 7, Jake caught sight of Master Sergeant Rodriguez near the main squadron building. The crew chief was talking animatedly with several other senior NCOs, and from their body language, Jake could tell they were discussing something serious. When Rodriguez spotted Jake and Sarah walking toward the Special Operations hangar, his expression changed to one of obvious concern. The debriefing that awaited them would prove to be unlike anything either pilot had experienced in their military careers, and it would provide answers to some of their questions while raising dozens of new ones. More importantly, it would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately reveal the truth about Marcus Williams and the classified mission that had cost him his life. The interior of Hangar 7 was unlike any military facility Jake had ever seen. Instead of the usual aircraft maintenance equipment and tool benches, the space had been converted into what appeared to be a sophisticated intelligence analysis center. Multiple large screens displayed satellite imagery, drone feeds, and digital maps covered with various symbols and markers. At least a dozen personnel in civilian clothes were working at computer terminals, and Jake could see that several of them were analyzing footage that he recognized from his own targeting pod. Waiting for them at a conference table in the center of the hangar were three individuals who immediately commanded attention. The first was Colonel Patricia Hayes, the wing commander, Jake's ultimate boss, and one of the most respected officers on the base. Her presence indicated that whatever they were about to discuss had implications at the highest levels of command. The second person was someone Jake didn't recognize, a middle-aged man in civilian clothes with the bearing and alertness of someone accustomed to operating in dangerous situations. The third person caused Jake's heart to skip a beat. It was Marcus Williams' father, Robert Williams, very much alive and clearly not in any hospital intensive care unit. "Captain Morrison, Captain Shun, please have a seat," Colonel Hayes said, her voice carrying the weight of authority, but also a note of something that might have been sympathy. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels, and I need your word that nothing discussed in this room will be repeated to anyone outside of authorized personnel." Jake and Sarah both nodded their acknowledgement, though Jake's mind was reeling from the sight of Robert Williams. The older man looked tired but healthy, dressed in what appeared to be military contractor clothing rather than the hospital gown Jake would have expected if the cover story about his medical emergency had been true. The civilian stepped forward and introduced himself as David Preston, a senior analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency. "Captains, first let me express my condolences on the loss of Captain Williams. Marcus was not just an exceptional pilot. He was also a crucial asset in an operation that has been years in the planning." Preston activated a large display screen that showed a detailed map of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, with numerous red markers indicating locations of interest. For the past 18 months, Captain Williams has been involved in a classified program designed to identify and eliminate high-value targets associated with a sophisticated weapons smuggling network operating along the border. His cover story about emergency leave was necessary to maintain operational security while he conducted reconnaissance missions in areas that were too dangerous for normal intelligence gathering operations. Jake felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place, though the complete picture was still unclear. "Sir, are you saying that Marcus wasn't really on leave? That his father wasn't in the hospital?" Robert Williams spoke for the first time, his voice heavy with emotion, but steady. "My son volunteered for this mission because he believed it would save American lives. The cover story about my medical emergency was his idea. He knew that his squadron mates would accept that explanation without asking too many questions." Colonel Hayes leaned forward across the table. "Captains, what Marcus was doing was incredibly dangerous, but it was also incredibly important. The intelligence he gathered over the past several weeks identified the locations of 3 major weapons caches and the movement patterns of several high-value targets that we've been trying to locate for over 2 years." Preston activated another screen showing what appeared to be surveillance footage from various sources. Yesterday morning, Captain Williams was conducting the final reconnaissance mission of his assignment when he discovered something unexpected. The weapons smuggling network wasn't just moving conventional arms. They had acquired surface-to-air missiles, sophisticated ones, and they were planning to use them against coalition aircraft. The implication of this revelation hit Jake immediately. If enemy forces had access to advanced anti-aircraft missiles, every coalition pilot in Afghanistan was at significantly increased risk. More importantly, it explained why Marcus had been flying at such low altitude when his aircraft crashed. He had been trying to avoid the very weapon systems he had discovered. Marcus transmitted his findings and was ordered to abort his mission and return to base immediately, Preston continued. "But approximately 30 minutes before you discovered his wreckage, we received an emergency transmission from his aircraft. He reported that he was being engaged by surface-to-air missiles and was attempting to evade. That was the last communication we received." Sarah spoke up for the first time since entering the hangar. "Sir, the wreckage pattern we observed was consistent with a missile hit, but Captain Williams appeared to maintain control of his aircraft until impact. If he was hit by a SAM, how did he manage to fly the aircraft into the mountain rather than just falling out of the sky?" Robert Williams answered her question, and Jake could hear the pride mixed with grief in the older man's voice. "My son was one of the best pilots the Air Force has ever produced, Captain Shun. Even with his aircraft severely damaged, he would have done everything possible to maintain control and avoid populated areas. The mountain he crashed into was uninhabited, If he had lost control over the valley where your ground troops were operating, the results could have been catastrophic. The full scope of Marcus Williams' final actions began to become clear to Jake. His friend hadn't just been a victim of enemy action. He had been a hero who had sacrificed his own life to protect others, even in his final moments. The realization was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Preston activated a final display showing real-time intelligence feeds from the border region. Based on the intelligence Captain Williams gathered, we launched coordinated strikes against the weapons caches and smuggling routes 3 hours ago. The operation was successful. We eliminated several high-value targets and destroyed enough advanced weaponry to significantly degrade enemy capabilities in this region for months to come. Colonel Hayes stood up from the table, signaling that the briefing was coming to an end. Captains, your discovery of Captain Williams' aircraft and your professional handling of the situation allowed us to confirm the success of his final mission. The intelligence data you recorded during your orbit of the crash site provided crucial confirmation that he had successfully transmitted his findings before being engaged by enemy forces. Jake realized that they had been unknowing participants in validating the success of a complex intelligence operation. Their targeting pod footage had apparently captured evidence that Marcus had completed his mission objectives even while under fire from the very weapon systems he had been sent to locate. What happens now? Sarah asked. How do we explain this to the squadron? People are going to ask questions about why Marcus was flying when he was supposed to be on leave. Preston exchanged glances with Colonel Hayes before responding. The official story will be that Captain Williams volunteered to return early from leave due to operational requirements, and that he was killed while providing close air support for the mission you were supporting. His role in the intelligence operation will remain classified indefinitely. Robert Williams stood up and walked over to where Jake and Sarah were sitting. I want you both to know that Marcus spoke about you often. He considered you his closest friends in the squadron, and he was proud to serve alongside you. What he did, what he sacrificed, was his choice. He believed that the intelligence he could gather would save the lives of other pilots and soldiers, and he was right. Jake felt tears threatening to form in his eyes as he thought about his friend's courage and dedication. Marcus Williams had voluntarily undertaken one of the most dangerous assignments imaginable, maintaining his cover story even with his closest friends, because he believed it was the right thing to do. As they prepared to leave the hangar, Preston handed each of them a sealed envelope. These contained the details of Captain Williams' commendations and decorations, which will be awarded posthumously. Obviously, the specific nature of his actions cannot be made public, but his service and sacrifice will be properly recognized. The walk back to their normal squadron facilities felt surreal to Jake. Less than 6 hours earlier, he had been preparing for what he thought would be a routine combat patrol. Instead, he had discovered that one of his closest friends had been living a double life, conducting dangerous intelligence missions while maintaining the appearance of normal squadron operations. When they reached the squadron building, Jake could see that word of Marcus Williams' death had already spread. Several pilots and crew members were gathered in small groups, talking quietly and with obvious concern. The mood was somber, as it always was when the squadron lost one of its own, but Jake knew that the full truth of Marcus's sacrifice would never be shared with these people who had also considered him a friend. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached Jake as he entered the building. Captain, I heard about Captain Williams. I know you two were close. I'm sorry for your loss. Jake thanked the crew chief, recognizing the genuine sympathy in the older man's voice. Rodriguez had been maintaining aircraft longer than Jake had been flying, and he had seen too many good pilots fail to return from missions. But Jake suspected that even Rodriguez would never know the full story of what Marcus Williams had been doing during his supposed emergency leave. That evening, Jake and Sarah met at the base club to talk about what they had learned and how they would handle the knowledge they now carried. The weight of keeping Marcus's secret was heavier than either of them had anticipated, and they both struggled with the realization that they would never be able to share the truth about their friend's heroism with the people who had known and respected him. He saved lives today, Sarah said quietly, staring into her coffee cup. Not just with the intelligence he gathered, but with the way he handled his aircraft after he was hit. If he had lost control over that valley, our ground troops could have been caught in the wreckage. Jake nodded, thinking about the final moments of Marcus Williams' life. Hit by an enemy missile, aircraft systems failing, but still maintaining enough control to guide his crippled A-10 away from friendly forces and into an uninhabited mountainside. It was the kind of heroism that would never make the newspapers or the evening news, but it represented the very best of what it meant to be a military aviator. In the months that followed, Jake and Sarah would carry the knowledge of their friend's true final mission with them through dozens of additional combat sorties. They would watch as Marcus Williams was officially recognized with a Distinguished Flying Cross and a Purple Heart, awarded for his exceptional heroism while providing close air support for ground forces engaged with enemy combatants. The citation would never mention the classified intelligence operation or the sophisticated weapons cache that his sacrifice had helped eliminate. Years later, when Jake had become a squadron commander himself, he would sometimes think about the lesson Marcus Williams had taught him about duty and sacrifice. His friend had understood that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that can never be publicly acknowledged, and that true heroism often requires carrying burdens that can never be shared. The tail number of Marcus Williams' A-10 would eventually be retired from service, a quiet tribute to a pilot whose greatest act of courage would forever remain known to only a few. But for Jake Morrison and Sarah Chun, the memory of that shocking recognition, seeing their friend's aircraft number appear on their targeting displays, would serve as a permanent reminder that the real heroes of war are often the ones whose stories can never be fully told.